everybody. Today we're going to talk Chapter 6, Learning. Please ignore that running water in the background. Unfortunately, we just have some issues going on with the house as always. There's something. So I'm going to watch an intro video. The first objective is, how do we learn? How do we define learning? And what are some basic, should be types of learning, so basic forms of learning? Learning is just the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. So it's basically just memories or skills that endure. Associative learning is learning that two certain events occur together. The events can either be two stimuli or a response and its consequences. So the two stimuli would be classical conditioning. The response and its consequences would be operant conditioning. A stimulus is just any event or situation that evokes a response. So basically, any type of sensory stimuli is going to be considered a stimulus because we respond to it. A respondent behavior is a behavior that occurs as an automatic response to some stimulus. And an operant behavior is a behavior that operates on the environment, producing a consequence. Cognitive learning is the acquisition of mental information, whether by observable events, by watching others, or through language. And observational learning is learning that we do through others' experiences. We're going to talk about classical conditioning first. What is classical conditioning and how does it demonstrate associative learning? What parts to acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination play in classical conditioning? And why is Pavlov's work important and how is it being applied? So Ivan Pavlov is the one who founded the idea of classical conditioning. He actually was a physiologist and he was studying the role of salivation and digestion. And he noticed that the salivation of dogs would occur not necessarily just when they were eating, but at the sight of food, the sight of a dish, the smell of the food, or the sight of the person who was actually bringing the food. And it kept kind of messing up his experiment because he couldn't figure out why exactly the dogs were doing this. So he installed test tubes into their salivary glands so he could then go on and measure salivation. So in all of this, when he started realizing that it wasn't just the mere food that was causing the dogs to salivate, he came up with this idea of classical conditioning. And it's a type of learning in which we link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. One of the important things to know about classical conditioning is that it's not voluntary learning. It just gets associated in our brain. It's not us actively trying to learn something. In order to understand classical conditioning, there's some vocab that we have to understand. The first is the unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that unconditionally, so naturally or automatically, triggers a response. In Pavlov's experiment, it's the food or the meat powder, depending on which source you use. Oh, excuse me. They're the same thing. The unconditioned response is an unlearned, naturally occurring response to an unconditioned stimulus. And this was the salivation. So Pavlov presented the dogs with food, the unconditioned stimulus, they salivated, the unconditioned response. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that evokes no response. So before his experiment, he would ring a bell and the dogs would do nothing. A conditioned stimulus is the originally neutral stimulus that after association with the unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. So this is the bell again. So what this means is that once it's conditioned, so once he has paired the food with the tone multiple times, that previously neutral stimulus now becomes the conditioned stimulus. And a conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. So now the dogs salivate in response to the bell or the tone without any food being present. And that is the idea of classical conditioning, is you want to get the unconditioned response, whatever it is in the experiment, and this experiment was salivation. That's what you want to get. So he was aiming to get that conditioned response, that salivation, just using the tone in the absence of that unconditioned stimulus. So how did he do this? So there's 3 basic steps. Step 1 is a neutral stimulus produces no response, and the unconditioned stimulus, the meat, powder, or the food, elicits that unconditioned response. Sorry, I don't know if I said the unconditioned stimulus, the meat, powder, or food, elicits the unconditioned response, which is the salivation. So that's step 1. There's no response to that neutral stimulus. Step 2, that neutral stimulus, the bell or the tone, is repeatedly paired with the conditioned stimulus, the meat, powder, or the food. So he rings the bell, gives them food, rings the bell, gives them food, rings the bell, gives them food, over and over and over and over again. And then in step 3, they produce the neutral stimulus, the bell, in the absence of food. So there's no food in step 3. They just ring the bell and the dogs salivate. And that is the point, is to get that conditioned response, which is the same as the unconditioned response, without that unconditioned stimulus. There are a lot of principles that go along with classical conditioning. The first is acquisition, and this is just when the link between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus begins to trigger the conditioned response. So this is that step 2 that we were talking about in the previous slide. Generalization is, after conditioning, the tendency to respond similarly to stimuli that resembles the conditioned stimulus. So let's say that Pavlov had like a little handbell that he was ringing, and then he hit like that little desk bell, you know, that the teachers used to have on their desk, or that they have on store counters to get people's attention. That would produce the salivation. So that's generalization. It's not the exact same tone or bell, but it's very similar, and it produces the same response. Discrimination is the opposite. It's the ability to distinguish between the conditioned stimulus and a similar stimuli that will not signal the unconditioned response. So Pavlov used that bell, and then let's say you ring a doorbell. They're both bells, but the dogs are going to know that that doorbell isn't going to produce the food, so they do not respond to it. Extinction is the weakening of a conditioned response when the unconditioned stimulus doesn't follow the conditioned stimulus. So what this means is, after so long of ringing the bell and no food being presented, ringing the bell, no food being presented, the dogs are going to salivate less and less each time they ring that bell without any food, and eventually they're going to stop salivating. Spontaneous recovery, however, is the reappearance after that weakened response or that extinction, where all of a sudden they have the conditioned response again. So let's say that we're doing this and they ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, and the dog stops salivating, but 3 hours later they ring the bell, the dog will start salivating again. And this shows that extinction just suppresses the response, but it doesn't actually eliminate the response completely. So Pavlov did leave some legacy behind. Cross species. So all species can be classically conditioned. So complex at the top of the pyramid, humans can be classically conditioned, and those sea slugs that only have like a couple of cells, they also can be classically conditioned. So it is a learning style that can learn across species. And he brought objectivity into science. So he showed that scientific study, not guessing what is going on, could actually be applied to psychology. So 2 important points that he left behind. We've talked about little Albert before. Remember, little Albert was the little boy that they banged the bar on when he was presented with a white rat, and they taught him, to fear the white rat. And this showed that you can condition an emotional response. So they conditioned him to fear that white rat. Previously, they didn't think that you could actually condition an emotion. but this showed that it can. Very unethical, not something that we'd be able to do today. And we talked about extinguish, which is the removal of a learned response. Counter conditioning is what they should have done to little Albert, but we're not really sure if they did. And counter conditioning is using conditioning to elicit the opposite response of what has previously been learned. So if they had counter conditioned little Albert, what they would have done is they would have had him playing with the white rat. And while he's playing with the white rat, they would have presented him with something that he really enjoyed. So probably a piece of candy. So they would present the white rat, they would present the candy. They would present the white rat, they would present the candy. And the idea behind counter conditioning is that if you are presenting something that's the opposite of whatever it was before, so he was conditioned to fear, and now you're presenting something that brings him joy, those two emotions can't exist at the same time. They would cancel each other out. So then he would now learn to associate that white rat with something pleasurable like the piece of candy. This also has a lot to do with phobias. So previously, people just thought that you had a phobia because of something. But the little Albert experiment showed that phobias can be learned. And oftentimes we learn phobias from our parents. So my mom hated spiders when I was growing up. So guess what I don't like? I don't like spiders all that much because she disliked them. And we'll learn in chapter 13, or as we learned in chapter 13, that phobias and anxiety are kind of considered like contagious disorders because it is something that can be learned. I'm going to watch a closing video. Just a funny little video to end classical conditioning. We're going to move on to operant conditioning. What is operant conditioning and how is operant behavior reinforced and shaped? How do positive and negative reinforcement differ and what are the basic types of reinforcers? How do continuous and partial reinforcement schedules affect behavior? How does punishment differ from negative reinforcement, and how does punishment affect behavior? Why were Skinner's ideas controversial, and how might his operant conditioning principles be applied? How does classical conditioning differ from operant conditioning? We're going to watch another short, quick video. Ooh, not that one. Okay, so operant conditioning is a type of learning in which a behavior becomes more probable if it's followed by a reinforcer and less probable if it's followed by punishment. And we'll talk about the different types of reinforcement and the different types of punishment in a minute. So we often associate operant conditioning with B.F. Skinner, but before that came Thorndike and his law of effect. His law of effect said that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. But you can probably guess what the problem with that is. So what is favorable and unfavorable? It's kind of relative. So for many of you youngins, going out on a Saturday night would be favorable. For many of us who are older, having to go out on a Saturday night would be unfavorable. So it's very subjective. I think I said objective earlier, maybe. So we have different types of methods of operant conditioning. And in order to understand how Skinner works, you have to understand what a discrete behavior is. And this isn't in your book. A discrete behavior is a small, simple behavior that can be observed, and it only requires one single response. So if you look at this picture, this is an operant box or a Skinner box. He hated that they were called Skinner boxes. And there's 3 lights you can kind of see above the pigeon. So in order to get reinforced, you see the pigeon is eating some food. They have to peck whichever light might be lit up or might be the correct color. So that discrete behavior is just one simple peck of that light. And using this box, as you can see, it's very small. Pigeons, remember, they kind of peck naturally when they walk, and they don't have a whole lot of room to move in that box. So eventually they're going to peck that accidentally and they're going to get rewarded. And then they're going to do it again and they're going to get rewarded. And eventually they're going to learn that if they peck that, then the consequence is going to be reinforcement. They're going to be rewarded. So in this, he was able to teach pigeons and other animals crazy things like walking in a figure 8. I think in the book it mentions like playing table tennis. So he was able to do all of these with this idea in mind, those discrete behaviors. They're going to come into play when we talk about shaping. So the beginnings of operant conditioning, this is B.F. Skinner. Isn't he so sassy looking? I just love him. So subjective versus objective, he really disliked Thorndike's terminology, pleasant and unpleasant, favorable and unfavorable, because it is very subjective. It's relative to each person. And he thought that we should focus on only observable, objective behaviors. He also understood the importance of immediacy. Using reinforcement or punishment immediately after the behavior makes it more likely that the person is going to learn. And this is another important key in terms of operant conditioning, is operant conditioning is not involuntary like classical conditioning. He's just so sassy. I just love him so much. So through those discrete behaviors, as I said, B.F. Skinner was able to shape his pigeons and other animals into doing very complex behaviors. And shaping is a procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior closer and closer towards a desired behavior. So let's say that my desired behavior is I want to go to the gym 7 days a week, and I don't go to the gym at all. So shaping is going to be reinforcing those behaviors that get me slowly closer to it. So I really like to read. So I'm going to reinforce myself with setting aside just a half an hour to read after I go to the gym. Successive approximations are the actual behaviors which are progressively closer to the target behavior. So during that first week where I'm going to the gym, I might only go 1 day a week, and then I get to read for 30 minutes after that. The next week, I'm going to go for 2 days a week, and then each of those 2 days, I'm going to get to read for 30 minutes after. The following week, I'm going to go 3 days, the following week 4 days, until I get up into that desired behavior of going 7 days a week. So those successive approximations are the increasing by 1 day each week. The whole procedure, so that 7 weeks of me increasing my days, that whole 7 weeks is the process of shaping. So let's talk about reinforcement first. Reinforcement is any event that strengthens the behavior it follows. So reinforcement makes the behavior more likely to occur. There's 2 types of reinforcement, positive and negative, and this is where kids often get confused because they don't understand this concept of negative reinforcement. They think that negative reinforcement is punishment, and it's not. They're different. Reinforcement and punishment are different. Punishment also has positive and negative. So positive reinforcers are things that increase the behavior by presenting a pleasurable stimulus. When it's presented after the response, it strengthens the behavior and makes it more likely to occur. So some examples of this are little kids when they're potty training, they might get a sticker or they might get an M&M immediately after going pee in the potty. That's a positive reinforcer. A negative reinforcer is increasing behaviors by stopping, reducing, or removing an aversive stimuli. It's when you remove this aversive stimuli after the response that strengthens it and makes it more likely to occur again. So if we think about when we get into the car, what's one of the first things that we do is we fasten our seatbelt. If we don't, then that ding starts to happen. And that ding won't go away until you fasten your seatbelt. That's an example of a negative reinforcer. Removing that annoying sound makes it more likely that you're going to fasten your seatbelt again in the future. Immediate reinforcers are exactly what they sound like. They're reinforcers that occur immediately after the behavior. They are the most effective. Delayed reinforcers is exactly what it sounds like. It's a reinforcer that does not occur immediately after, because it doesn't occur immediately after, it doesn't allow that link to be made between the behavior and the reinforcement. It's not as effective, especially because people have trouble seeing the long-term benefits of a behavior that they're doing immediately. Primary reinforcers are something that are innately reinforcing. They satisfy a biological need, such as food and water. And secondary or conditioned reinforcers are events that gain reinforcement through a link with a primary reinforcer. So it could be things like money or power. Those are secondary reinforcers. They're things that we have learned or we've been conditioned to be rewarding or reinforcing. When we talk about reinforcement, we have to talk about schedules of reinforcement. And a schedule of reinforcement is just the pattern that defines how often a desired response will be reinforced. Continuous is reinforcing a desired response every time it occurs. So if you're teaching your dog how to sit, then you reward the dog with a treat every single time they sit, every single time. This leads to really quick learning, but it also leads to really quick extinction. Partial reinforcers are when you reinforce a response only part of the time. It leads to slower learning, but it's more resistant to extinction. An interval is a period of time. So a fixed interval, a specified amount of time must pass before the correct response gets reinforced. So let's say you have a pigeon in that Skinner box and the fixed interval is 2 minutes. So they hit that lever and they get reinforced. It doesn't matter how many times they continue to hit that lever. They're not going to get reinforced again until 2 minutes has passed. And when you have a fixed interval, you get this interval scallop, which is this purple line. So what happens is they get reinforced and then they don't respond at all. And as it gets closer to that 2-minute mark, you kind of see it shoot up because they know they're about to get reinforced, so their rate of response increases. They get reinforced and it just kind of plateaus. You see how it's flat. And then again, as it gets closer to that 2-minute, that rate of response skyrockets because they know that time period is about to elapse. A variable interval is reinforcement after an unpredictable amount of time has passed before they get reinforced. So they hit the lever and 30 seconds has to pass, and then they hit the lever and 2 minutes has to pass, and then they hit the lever and 1 minute has to pass. The amount of time is unpredictable. It results in lower but steadier patterns of behavior. A fixed ratio just means the number of responses. A fixed ratio is reinforcement is given after a specified number of correct responses. So they have to peck 3 times before they get reinforced, and then they have to peck 3 times before they get reinforced, and then 3 times. A variable is reinforcement is given after an unpredictable number of correct responses. So they peck and they get reinforced, and then they don't get reinforced for another 5 pecks, and then another 3 pecks, and then another 2 pecks. The number of pecks is unpredictable. Both ratio schedules maintain a high rate of response. Variable schedules produce more consistent responses, though, and you can see this by the graph. This is a token board. A token economy is when they are reinforced in the forms of tokens, and then when they get the correct number of tokens, then they can trade it in. So as you can see, this child is working for a ball, and when they get 3 stars, then they're going to have time to trade in and play with the ball. So when I taught in a self-contained classroom, we used a variable interval schedule, and I had a little timer. So when the timer went off, if the kids were doing what they were supposed to be doing, which most of the time was keeping their hands and their feet themselves and not destroying anything, they got a token. And then after they got 3 or 4 tokens, they would have a chance to trade in for some free time with a preferred toy or some type of edible is usually what they like to trade in for. Behavior modification is altering a behavior through learning techniques. This slide is not in your book. ABA, applied behavior analysis, is usually the method that they do this, and it's when they alter behavior through research-backed methods by breaking it down into parts. And they often do this by an ABC chart, which is this next slide. So ABC is antecedent, behavior, consequence. So antecedent, what happened right before the behavior, what was it, and the consequence, what happened after. And remember, consequence can be positive or negative. It's just what happened after. And most ABC charts are a little bit more complex. They have the date, the setting. That gives a little bit more information when we want to look at patterns and try to figure out, is it a time of day? Is it a person? Is it a class? Is it a subject? Is it a specific demand? That sort of thing. And then they do what's called a functional behavior assessment, and this seeks to discover the function of the behavior. And the behaviors are usually attention, avoidance, sensation seeking. And there's one more. What is it? Oh, something tangible. And it replaces the behavior with an appropriate one that achieves the same function. So if every time I give a student a math worksheet, they rip it up, they're escaping that task. So you can't have a kid ripping up their paper every time. So instead you might say, okay, here's your math paper. You can have a 2-minute break or you can start right now. And they're going to choose the 2-minute break. So they still get to escape, but it's in an appropriate way. So punishment is the opposite of reinforcement. Punishment is any consequence that decreases the frequency of the behavior it follows. And like I said, there's both positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment is an event that decreases a behavior by administering or adding a negative stimulus. So spanking, for example, is positive punishment. And I know people have a hard time wrapping their head around spanking being positive punishment, but it's positive because you're adding in that negative stimuli of pain. So I had a kid in school whose grandmother would whip him and she would make him go outside and choose the tree branch. Also an example of positive punishment because he's adding that tree branch. Negative punishment is an event that decreases the behavior by removing a rewarding stimulus. So if I hit my brother and then my mother took away my toy, that's negative punishment. I'm going to be less likely to hit him again because she took away something that I really liked, my toy. Time out is negative punishment. And it's negative punishment because in timeout, you are removing attention from the child, and that attention is something that is pleasurable. And this is oftentimes why timeout doesn't work, right? So a lot of times parents will go and put the kid in the corner and be like, okay, you have to stand there for 2 minutes. And the kid starts crying and they come out of the corner. And the parents is like, I know, this is really difficult. This is really tough, but you hit your brother. You have to stand in the corner for 2 minutes. That is doing the exact opposite. That is not removing that attention. That's giving them the attention. So when they do that, when they come over and they're crying, you're supposed to look away and not give any type of verbal, and you you guide them back into the corner gently, not push them. And then you reset the timer. And then when they come out again, you do the same thing. You guide them back to the corner without giving them any eye contact, without giving them any verbal contact. Eventually, they're going to learn that they have to stand in the corner for 2 minutes. Primary punishers are unlearned innate stimulus that punish and make it less likely that the behavior will occur again, such as hunger and thirst. Secondary punishers are those things that we learn are punishing, such as poor grades or a speeding ticket. So punishment is much less effective than reinforcement, but there are some times that you do have to use punishment. But there are a couple of keys. To decrease the behavior, It has to be clear. You cannot hit your brother. It has to be direct. Teresa, you cannot hit your brother. It has to be consistent. Every time I hit my brother, my mother has to say, Teresa, you cannot hit your brother. And it has to be immediate. So the second that I do it, I have to get punished. If you don't have those 4 things, clear, direct, consistent, and immediate, punishment isn't going to work. In general, sometimes it just doesn't like to click to the next one. Punishment is not effective. Behavior is not forgotten. It's suppressed but not forgotten. If you get in trouble for hitting your brother, you're just going to learn not to hit your brother when your mother is around. The behavior is not replaced. It doesn't provide direction for what children should do instead. You're punished for what you did, but you're not taught what you should do instead. Discrimination. It teaches children where they can do the behavior and not to not do it. It teaches fear. They associate fear with the behavior and the person, and it increases aggression. Spanked children are at risk for increased aggression. Spanking, I know, is different than abuse, but it's that idea of that cycle of abuse. If you're spanked, then you're more likely to spank your children. So if we want to change a behavior, they give some general guidelines. State a realistic goal in measurable terms and announce it. So I want to go to the gym 7 days a week, every week. Decide how, when, and where you'll work towards the goal. I'm going to go to the gym that is across the street from my house every morning before I go to work, and then first thing in the morning on the weekends. Monitor how often you engage in your desired behavior. So there's tracking apps on your phone, or you can have a calendar and you can put a check and an X on the days that you went and didn't go. Reinforce the desired behavior. Like I said, I really like to read, so I'm going to read for half an hour after, and then reduce the rewards gradually. So after I'm consistently going, remember that it takes about 66 days, so about 2 months, to make a habit. So after I'm going to the gym 7 days a week for about 2 months, then I'm going to start reducing that reward. So then maybe every other day I'll only be able to read, and then maybe every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then maybe just 2 days a week. So I'm going to gradually reduce that reward. So here's just a general breakdown of operant conditioning. Reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is the behavior followed by a reward. Negative reinforcement is a behavior followed by the removal of something unpleasant. And punishment, positive punishment is a behavior followed by something unpleasant. And negative punishment is behavior followed by the removal of something pleasant. So it is confusing, so think of it in terms of math. If it's positive, you add something. For reinforcement, you add something pleasant for doing the behavior. And for punishment, you add something unpleasant for doing the behavior. So in positive reinforcement, adding something pleasant makes the behavior more likely to occur. In punishment, adding something unpleasant makes the behavior less likely to occur. In negative, you subtract something. So reinforcement, you subtract something unpleasant for doing the behavior. And in punishment, you subtract something pleasant for doing the behavior. So reinforcement, subtracting something unpleasant makes the behavior more likely to occur. And in punishment, subtracting something pleasant makes the behavior less likely to occur. So for reinforcement, it is the behavior followed by a reward. It's the reinforcer that makes it likely for the behavior to reoccur. Some examples are M&Ms during potty training and dog treats for sitting and shaking. A negative reinforcement is behavior followed by the removal of an aversive stimuli. It's the removal of something negative that makes it more likely for the behavior to reoccur. And some examples include getting out of prison early for good behavior. Punishment, positive punishment is behavior followed by something unpleasant. It's the unpleasant stimuli that makes the behavior less likely to occur again. And some examples are getting your mouth washed out with soap for swearing, and antabuse, which makes people sick after drinking alcohol. Negative punishment is behavior followed by the removal of something pleasant. So taking away of something reinforcing that makes the behavior less likely to occur again. And some examples are a timeout, child gets removed from attention, and losing a toy. Just like classical conditioning, operant conditioning also has some different components. Acquisition is when the reinforced response gets strengthened. Generalization is when the response learned in one situation occur in other situations. So if I was rewarded for saying please and thank you at my home by positive verbal phrase, my parents were like, oh, you're such a polite person. I'm going to say please and thank you to my teacher. Discrimination is a little bit different. Discrimination is the ability to distinguish responses that are going to be reinforced versus responses that are going to be punished. So this picture here is an example of discrimination. So the little rat gets pellets or he gets shocked. So if the green light is on and he presses a lever, he's going to get pellets. But if the red light is on and he presses a lever, he's going to get shocked. So he is going to learn when he should and should not press that lever. And the discriminative stimuli is the actual stimuli that indicates if a reinforcement is available or not. So those colored lights are the discriminative stimuli in this example. An extinction is the weakening of a response which is no longer reinforced. An extinction often occurs because there's a lengthy period of time between the event and the reinforcement or the punishment. We're going to talk biology, cognition, and learning. What limit does biology place on conditioning? How do cognitive processes affect classical and operant conditioning? So the main one that we're going to talk about is taste aversion. Taste aversion is classical conditioning that occurs with taste or smell of food. This is adaptive to survival. As people and animals, we learn not to eat things that are poisonous. There's some differences with classical conditioning though, and that it only needs to happen one time. So in classical conditioning, you have to have repeated pairing of the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, but in food conditioning, it only has to occur once. So I had the stomach flu and I ate McDonald's chicken nuggets. I could not eat McDonald's chicken nuggets for probably 20 years. But it only took that one time of me puking after eating it for me to learn it. Oftentimes, for those of you who are older than 21, you know the first time that you get sick after drinking, you often cannot have that same drink. You can't taste it, you can't smell it. It automatically makes you sick. Some of the implications is it shows that some stimuli are stronger than others. Some are resistant to extinction. Pairings are adaptive when more than one stimuli is involved, and we know which is more likely to cause the response. And this was all proven through Garcia and Kohling. They did this experiment where they paired sweetened water with a shock, and shock makes rats nauseous. So they paired just one time that sweetened water with the shock, and the rats avoided the water after that. So they learned that only one time in terms of taste aversion. Biological preparedness, we learn which objects pose threats, and we quickly form associations between fear and danger of those objects. So things like cliffs, snakes, spiders, bad food, we learn very quickly what to avoid. And they don't mention instinctive drift by name in the book, but they kind of talk about it. It's the tendency for a conditioned response to revert back to their innate response patterns. So for example, if I have a hunting dog and I take my dog hunting and I have conditioned my dog to wait until I give him the command after I shoot a bird, and he does this, let's say 15 times. The first 15 times that we go hunting, I shoot a bird, he sees it falling, and he waits until I give the command for him to go find the bird. But then all of a sudden, the 16th time, I shoot the bird and he just takes off after that bird. His instinct has taken over his conditioning. Doesn't matter that he's learned and has done it multiple times. Eventually, that innate response is just going to take over, and it's going to outride or override the learning that he had. The next one is cognition and operant conditioning. Behaviorism is the school of thought that really focuses on objective, observable behaviors. And it states that psychology should be an objective science that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. So basically, we're looking at those observable behaviors, and we're not really looking at why they occur. We're just looking at when, where, and how they occur. One example of cognitive conditioning is a cognitive map. It's a mental image of the layout of one's environment. So if you're like me, I wear contacts and I'm pretty blind without them. But let's say in the middle of the night, I get up and I'm super thirsty. I can walk through my downstairs without my glasses or contacts and know where to step to avoid the furniture because I have this mental image of the layout of my environment. In latent learning, remember we've learned latent means hidden, is learning that's not apparent until there's an incentive to demonstrate it. So a lot of times if parents have two kids and they're pretty close in age, the younger kid develops language a little bit slower. And the reason for this is often because the older sibling just knows what they want and they do it. And it's oftentimes not until the older sibling goes off to preschool or school that all of a sudden their language blooms. It's not that it wasn't there. It's not that they didn't know. It was there. It was hidden. They just didn't have to use it until they needed some type of incentive for it. So now they actually had to use their words to get what they want, whereas before their sibling would just get it for them without them having to say it. Learning by observation. What is observational learning? How may observational learning be enabled by neural mirroring? What is the impact of pro-social modeling and of anti-social modeling? And what is the violence viewing effect? So this is our last section for chapter 6. Observational learning is exactly what it sounds like. It's learning by observing others. And we do this through modeling, which is the process of observing and then imitating the specific behavior. We do have vicarious reinforcement and punishment. And this is when we anticipate the consequence in a situation because we can identify with the person who we have seen get this consequence. So we're reinforced or punished through what other people do or say. When we talk about observational learning, we do this through Bandora's doll. So I know, just like in that video of little Albert with a creepy Santa Claus mask, everything in psychology has to be a little bit creepy. So this is Bobo the doll, and they had children observe their parents playing with Bobo the doll. So if the parents treated Bobo unkindly, if they hit him, if they threw him, the children were more likely to hit and throw Bobo. If they treated Bobo the doll kindly, they were more likely to treat them kindly. But not only that, if you look at those pictures, they really paid attention and imitated. So in the top left one, you can see the woman kind of throwing Bobo in the air, and then you can see the two children underneath her attempting to throw Bobo the doll. In the right top picture, you can kind of see she's hitting him with both fists. And then there's a hammer in her hand, in her left hand. And then you can see in the picture of the little boy beneath it, he's got the hammer and he's hitting, and the girl is raising her hands above her head to hit Bobo the doll. And there's key 4 factors when we talk about observational learning. The first is attention. Observational learning requires attention. They have to pay attention to what their model is. Retention, they have to know and remember the model's instructions and demonstrations and their actions. Reproduce, they imitate the model in motivation. They're more likely to imitate if a behavior is reinforced. So if you think about like a little kid who's 2 or 3 and they swear and the parents laugh because it's funny. And then what does the kid do? They start swearing over and over again because they're being reinforced. We do have mirror neurons. These are neurons that fire when we perform certain actions and when we perform or when we observe others performing those actions. It's a neural basis for imitation and observational learning. And it talks in the book in depth about things like pro-social behavior or antisocial behavior. But if we think of it in terms of our mirror neurons, there's 3 things that we often do when we see other people do it. We yawn, we laugh, and we cry. Just saying the word yawn makes me want to yawn. Okay, let's talk pro-social behavior and antisocial behavior. Pro-social behavior is positive, constructive, helpful behavior. Viewing it boosts helpful behavior in other people. Antisocial behavior is negative, destructive, or harmful behavior. Exposure to it makes you become more desensitized and you're more likely to repeat that harmful behavior. And the last slide talks about real-world applications of cognitive and social learning. And this is talking about what happens when we view violence. So the media does have an influence on us. Oftentimes, if we see minorities depicted in a demeaning and stereotypical way, we start to believe that that is the norm. So very sorry, I lost my train of thought. My phone was going off. So very relevant example is both Elon Musk and President Trump had used the word retarded in speeches that they were giving. And some disability groups did a study of social media and they found this massive increase of other people using it after they heard these 2 people use it because it became the norm. If you look back to like the 1930s and the 1940s and the way Black people were depicted in cartoons, that kind of furthered the prejudice and the stereotypes that they had of African Americans. Advertising is also influenced by the media. It tells us what we should buy, what we should drink, what we think we should look like, what we should feel. And there are some links with aggressive behavior. So when we're talking about aggressive media, we're talking about TV, movies, music, video games. 61% of TV shows show violence and 39% had gun violence. Research shows that violence in TV, movies, video games is a risk factor for increasing emotional arousal, aggressive behavior, and violent thoughts. Think about it, right? So if you are playing a video game and you're really into it and you're trying to win and your emotions are all heightened and then you lose, what do people often do? They throw the remote because you have that heightened emotional arousal. Video games have the greatest risk because it's kind of that first person where you're the one who's actually taking part in the violence. It contributes even if it doesn't cause it. Remember, correlation does not mean causation. Viewing violent media has a link with aggressive behavior, juvenile delinquency, dating violence, and males are more likely than females to be affected by it. And higher grades actually reduce the contributions of violent media on violent behavior. So it could be a couple of things. Most likely if people have super high grades, it's because they have very involved parents, and that also kind of mitigates it. So some links with aggressive behavior. Observational learning. So we learn from what we see. We're more likely to imitate the behavior than words. So if I'm playing Grand Theft Auto and I kick a granny walking along and I kick the cane out from under her, I see me doing that on the video game, I'm more likely to do that in person if I see a granny walking down the street. Disinhibition. It promotes disinhibition of violence when watching people get away with it. And disinhibition, so inhibition is the ability to stop it. So disinhibition is when you just do whatever you want. So if I am watching Grand Theft Auto and I hit the granny and nothing happens to me, I'm more likely to do it in real life because I think that I'm going to get away with it. Increased emotional arousal. Violent media gets people really aroused. They get worked up. When we're worked up, we are more likely to be aggressive. Priming of aggressive thoughts and memories. So seeing violent media triggers violent ideas and memories. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a granny, I might smile at her because my grandma I loved and I miss her. But if I'm playing Grand Theft Auto and I hit that granny and knock her over, when I see a granny on the street, I'm more likely to knock her over because it triggers those violent events that I was doing when I was playing Grand Theft Auto. Habituation. You become used to it and see violence as the norm, and it also increases disinhibition. Provision of aggressive scripts. It shows roles and scripts of how to navigate life situations using violence. So, for example, this is why we call it the cycle of abuse, right? So if your dad comes home and he's really angry, he has had a bad day at work and he takes it out on you by smacking you around, you're learning that when you're upset and angry, you use violence to make yourself feel better. And some other mitigating factors. Kids with aggressive personalities seek out aggressive media. Parental substance abuse, paternal physical punishment. So if your dad punishes you physically, single parenthood, and parental rejection all make it more likely that violent media will have an influence on somebody's behavior. That's it for chapter 6. I will see you guys back for chapter 7, where we're going to talk about memory.